On the sea islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, barrier islands separated from the mainland by salt marshes and tidal rivers, there lives a community that preserved something no other group of African Americans managed to keep intact. They preserved Africa itself, not a memory of Africa, not a cultural approximation. Africa, the languages, the basket weaving techniques, the rice cultivation methods, the religious practices, the food traditions, preserved in almost unbroken continuity from the moment their ancestors were taken from the West African coast to the present day. The Gullah-Geechee people are the descendants of enslaved West Africans who worked the coastal plantations of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Their geographic isolation on the sea islands, cut off from the mainland by water, created the conditions for a cultural preservation that is unique in the African diaspora, and a landmark DNA study published in December 2025 has now given us the most precise picture yet of exactly where in Africa they came from, and why their genetic profile may make them the founding maternal lineage for all legacy African Americans. The terms Gullah and Geechee refer to the same people and culture, with a geographic distinction. In South Carolina, the community is known as Gullah. In Georgia and northeastern Florida, they are known as Geechee. Together, the Gullah-Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor stretches along the sea islands and coastal areas from Wilmington to St. Augustine. Their distinctiveness comes from a specific historical circumstance. During the height of the Atlantic slave trade, approximately 40% of all enslaved Africans brought to the American colonies passed through Charleston. The coastal plantations of the Low Country demanded a very specific kind of labor, the cultivation of rice, indigo, and sea island cotton. And rice cultivation was a skill that West Africans, particularly those from the region known as the Rice Coast, had developed over centuries. Plantation owners specifically sought enslaved people from rice-growing regions of West Africa because they knew how to do what the owners needed. The Mende, the Kissi, the Susu, the Baga, the Temne, and other ethnic groups of Sierra Leone and Guinea were brought to the sea islands. And because they arrived in concentrated numbers, and because the geographic isolation limited contact, they maintained a cultural and linguistic cohesion. The result is the Gullah language, a Creole language that combines English with elements of multiple West African languages, particularly Mende and Creole. It is one of only 2 Creole languages with indigenous African roots that survived in the United States. And it is a living linguistic record of the specific African cultures that were brought to the sea islands. In December 2025, a research team published a study that is already being cited as one of the most important genetic analyses of African American heritage. The study, published in Advances in Clinical Medicine Research, examined mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material inherited through the maternal line, from 189 participants. These included 79 Gullah-Geechee individuals and 110 African Americans from other communities across the United States. Mitochondrial DNA is particularly valuable for tracing maternal ancestry because it does not recombine and is passed essentially unchanged from mother to child. The study found that haplogroups L2 and L3 dominated in both groups, but with a significant difference. Among Gullah-Geechee participants, L2 accounted for 28% and L3 for 54.7%. In comparison, the broader group had slightly different percentages, but the most revealing finding was what was absent. Non-L haplogroups, those associated with European and Native American ancestry, were present in less than 2%. In the broader African American comparison group, non-L haplogroups were more prevalent, reflecting generations of contact since the colonial period. The conclusion was extraordinary. The Gullah-Geechee show greater maternal genetic purity and a closer, less admixed connection to their West African origins. The researchers propose that the Gullah-Geechee may represent a founding biocultural population for legacy African Americans as a whole. Their maternal lineages, preserved through geographic isolation, may be the closest living genetic record of the West African populations. The genetic and linguistic evidence converges on one specific region, Sierra Leone, and the surrounding coastal areas of Guinea and Liberia. Records show a disproportionate number of enslaved people brought to the Carolina coast came from the Sierra Leone region. Linguistically, the Gullah language contains structural elements and vocabulary items that trace directly to Mende and Creole, the major languages of Sierra Leone. In 1989, a group of Gullah scholars traveled to Sierra Leone to meet with the Mende people, an encounter documented in family across the sea. They heard words they recognized from the Gullah language being used in everyday conversation in a West African village. A woman demonstrating basket weaving techniques used the same methods that Gullah women had maintained on the Sea Islands for 2 centuries. The DNA now confirms what the language and the baskets already suggested. The Gullah-Geechee are as close to their origins as any diaspora community. Their isolation preserved not just their culture, but their genes. And their genes point, with unusual precision, to Sierra Leone. The geographic isolation of the Sea Islands was the primary reason the Gullah-Geechee culture survived. But one historical event in particular accelerated that isolation and gave the community a unique moment of self-determination that left its mark on everything that followed. In November 1861, Union naval forces captured Port Royal Sound in South Carolina, one of the finest natural harbors on the Atlantic coast. The plantation owners fled to the mainland, abandoning their properties and the enslaved people who worked them. Approximately 10,000 enslaved people were suddenly, without any formal emancipation, left to themselves on the Sea Islands. The Port Royal experiment, as it became known, was the United States government's first large-scale attempt to manage the transition of enslaved people to freedom. Northern missionaries, teachers, and government agents arrived to provide education and organize labor. But the Gullah people had already begun organizing themselves. They continued farming the land, established their own systems of community governance, and maintained their cultural practices largely on their own terms. When emancipation came in 1863, and later when the 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery in 1865, the Gullah-Geechee on the Sea Islands were already more than 3 years into a form of practical freedom. General William Sherman's Special Field Order No. 15 in January 1865, the famous 40 acres and a mule order, set aside the Sea Islands and coastal lands for distribution to formerly enslaved people. Although this order was quickly reversed by President Andrew Johnson after Lincoln's assassination, it represented a moment when the Gullah-Geechee almost became landowners. The post-war period saw some Gullah-Geechee communities maintain control of their island lands through determined legal and financial maneuvering. The Penn Center on St. Helena Island, established as one of the first schools for freed African Americans in the South, became a cultural and educational anchor that helped preserve Gullah culture through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Martin Luther King Jr. used the Penn Center as a retreat for planning civil rights strategy in the 1960s, recognizing it as a place of historical significance. The Gullah-Geechee cultural preservation is not merely historical. It is active, living, and scientifically significant in ways that extend far beyond cultural heritage. The sweetgrass basket tradition of the Gullah-Geechee is one of the most documented examples of African cultural continuity in the Americas. The coiled grass baskets, made and sold by Gullah women in Charleston's Market District, are direct descendants of baskets made in Sierra Leone and Senegal. These specific techniques, the way the grass is gathered, dried, and coiled, the tools used to bind the coils, trace back to West African traditions. The food traditions of the Gullah-Geechee shaped American cuisine more broadly than most Americans realize. Red rice, okra soup, hoppin' john, shrimp, and grits. These dishes have direct origins in West African cooking traditions. The okra plant itself was brought to the Americas by enslaved West Africans who preserved its seeds during the Middle Passage. Rice cultivation techniques developed in Sierra Leone and Guinea were applied to the South Carolina Low Country, making it highly productive. The Gullah language itself is a living artifact of the Middle Passage. Linguists have documented over 4,000 words in Gullah that derive from African languages. Everyday English words, including goober, gumbo, and tote, derive from West African languages through the Gullah linguistic pathway. The same geographic isolation that preserved Gullah-Geechee culture for centuries is now the source of an existential threat to that culture. The Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia, once considered too remote and mosquito-ridden to attract outside interest, are now among the most desirable real estate in the American South. Hilton Head Island, once a Gullah community, is now one of the most exclusive resort destinations on the East Coast. Kiawa Island, Daufuski Island, Fripp Island, islands that were Gullah homelands for generations, have been transformed by development, rising property values, and the displacement of Gullah families who cannot afford the property taxes. The 2010 census estimated the Gullah-Geechee population at approximately 500,000 people, but the number of those who live in traditional communities, speak the Gullah language, and maintain cultural connections is far smaller and declining. Language death is a particular concern. The Gullah language, spoken fluently by elders, is not being passed to younger generations at the required rate. Linguists estimate that without intervention, Gullah could become extinct as a living community language within 2 to 3 generations. The Gullah-Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, established by Congress, provides some federal recognition and support for preservation efforts, but federal recognition has not stopped the economic forces pushing families off the land their ancestors worked. The December 2025 study identifying the Gullah-Geechee as potential progenitors of African North American maternal lineage has vast implications. For the millions of African Americans who have taken DNA ancestry tests in search of their origins deliberately obscured by slavery, the Gullah-Geechee genetic data provides a potential window. Because they maintained a closer connection to their West African origins, their haplogroup profiles may provide a reference point for tracing ancestry. The transatlantic slave trade robbed millions of people of the ability to know where in Africa their ancestors came from. Names were changed, languages were suppressed, family connections were deliberately broken. The DNA is one of the few threads that survived. And the Gullah-Geechee, because their isolation preserved those threads, may hold genetic keys that help others trace their ancestry across the ocean. A community that was isolated and threatened with cultural erasure may turn out to be one of the most genetically significant in the African diaspora. The people the wider world overlooked may be the ones who remembered the most. Sea islands cut off by salt marshes, a language that carries 4,000 African words, basket weaving techniques unchanged from Sierra Leone, a genetic profile more closely connected to West Africa than any other. A study suggesting they may be the founding lineage for legacy African Americans. The Gullah-Geechee were never what we thought, not because the story was wrong, but because we were not paying close enough attention. The people who preserved something that nobody else managed to keep, Africa itself, carried across the ocean and maintained through isolation. Subscribe to Hidden Origins for more stories history overlooked. Drop a comment. Did you know their DNA connects millions to West African origins?